How's it going, my awesome bunch of bakers? I hope you're having a great day. Welcome back to the channel. Today we have another episode of the Principles of Baking playlist. We'll be comparing different surfaces for bread baking. So let's go to the kitchen and check them out. Baking bread on a hot solid surface can be quite beneficial. It helps the bread achieve better oven spring, and the crust can get nicely browned and crispy. Cast iron is one of the best surfaces to bake your bread on. It is extremely dense and heavy. It holds and radiates heat really well. It is not cheap, but it's extremely durable. If you look after your cast iron pan, it will outlive you easily. What's especially good about this is that it has a lid. The lid will trap steam inside. Steam prevents the crust from drying out, and that's another way of getting great rise. There is a whole episode about steaming, which you can find in the Principles of Baking playlist. The only disadvantage of this pan is its size and shape. It can't hold all the breads. The size and shape of the next piece of equipment is quite good, but this coated aluminium pan is extremely light. Such a tray does not hold the heat very well, and it can cool down quite rapidly when you place a large piece of dough on it. I prefer using this for smaller bakes like burger buns or dinner rolls, which are proofed on the tray and then moved into the oven. Another common surface used in bread making is stone. I think most commercial bread ovens have a stone floor, and it can work really well if you have the right kind of stone. This is very light and porous. It doesn't hold or radiate heat very well, and it soaks up pretty much anything you place on it. So after baking just a few pizzas, it looks pretty nasty, and there's no way to clean it. Next up, we have a baking steel. This is one of my favorite pieces of equipment. It is extremely dense and heavy, and it holds the heat just as well as the cast iron pan does. And the best thing about it is that it's big. Of course, compared to a cast iron pot, there's one downside: it doesn't have a lid. But there are some good options for steaming out there. If I had to choose between this and a cast iron pot with a lid, I would definitely go for this. But let's run them against each other and see how they compare. What I have here today is a cold bulk fermented dough. It's made with white flour and it has a hydration of 70%. It has been in the fridge for 24 hours. Since we're testing 4 baking surfaces, I'm dividing this into 4 equal pieces. I will pre-shape the dough, then I'll let it rest for 15 minutes, then I'll do the final shaping and the final proof, which will only take about an hour. Once we start baking the first loaf, the other 3 will be placed back into the fridge to slow the fermentation down and stop them from overproofing. All the loaves will have a piece of non-stick paper underneath them. It's just there to help me move them from the table to the oven. It will not have any negative effects on the test. All the baking surfaces will be preheated and the breads will be baked at 220 degrees Celsius fan off. That is around 430 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, with all the details out of the way and the final proof done, we can get our first loaf in the oven. And we'll start with the cast iron pan. I will not be using the lid since we're only testing the surfaces, but I will spray all the loaves with water before they go in the oven. Again, you'll find a video about steaming in the Principles of Baking playlist. While the cast iron pan is small and it can't hold very many breads, the positive side of that is that it can be moved out of the oven. This makes loading the loaf into the oven far easier. You take the pan out, make sure you don't burn your table, place the loaf in the pan and then move the pan with the loaf to the oven. And once it's done baking, you just take the whole pan out again. All 4 loaves will be baked for exactly the same time, which is 30 minutes. I will try to keep things as equal as I can here. The first loaf rose up pretty well, although it is a little bit misshapen. But that's not important here. Let's look at the bottom. And predictably, it has browned quite nicely. We'll leave this to cool down and move on to the next surface, which is the baking steel. I really like using this because it can accommodate many breads at once, and it doesn't stain like my stone does. Plus, it is just as durable as a cast iron skillet. My baking steel never leaves the oven. I always keep it in there on the same rack. It works perfectly together with a baking tray. So when I'm baking some burger buns, which are final proofed on a baking tray, I can place the tray on the steel. The steel transfers heat to the tray, and I get a nicely brown crust on my buns, and a good rise of course. This looks like it's risen pretty well too. And looking at the bottom, we can see that it's browned quite nicely. So let's move right on to the baking stone, or pizza stone as it's sometimes known. I bought this before I bought my baking steel, and I didn't realize that it's going to be so light and porous. I definitely do not recommend a stone like this. If you want to use a baking stone, then I would suggest going with granite or marble. Those types of stone are heavy and solid. They will heat up and hold the heat really well. The only problem with a stone is that it can break. And I personally don't see any advantage to using a baking stone instead of a baking steel that I used earlier. I mean, I guess a stone doesn't rust, but if you look after your steel, it won't either. And while a stone can break, steel can't. Okay, here's our pale bottom loaf. Let's leave this to cool down and move on to the final baking surface, which is the coated aluminium tray, or aluminum tray, as my American friends would say. It is the most basic baking surface, and if you have ever used your oven, you must have one of these trays at home. It is perfectly fine to bake a loaf of bread on this, but it's definitely not the best surface for baking on. It works best for rolls and buns, which must be fermented on the tray before being moved to the oven. It would not be the best for baking baguettes on, for example, or ciabattas or pizza. Those kinds of breads require a solid hot surface. Even though this time it worked out pretty well, I would still go for the steel or the cast iron. Well, let's compare these side by side. Not the most beautiful loaves, I'll admit, but what's important is their bottoms. They are still in the same order here, from left to right. Number 1 is the cast iron pan, number 2 is the baking steel, number 3 is the baking stone, and number 4 is the tray. And I must say I was quite surprised at how well the aluminium tray did. The thing is that I didn't expect it to be better than the stone. Maybe it was the coating on that tray that transferred the heat quite well. Still, comparing all 4 of them, the cast iron pan and the baking steel definitely did the best. The first 2 breads have the darkest and most evenly colored crust, and the crust on the stone baked one looks miserable. It is clearly underbaked. Of course, that would not be the end of the world. If the bottom crust of your loaf looks like that, you can simply flip it over. Let it bake for another 5 minutes to brown the bottom. I have done that countless times. But if you are using cast iron or steel, you won't have to. I spoke about oven spring at the beginning of the video. Of course, I don't have the best examples for you here today, but we can see some slight differences. The first 2 loaves, baked in the cast iron pan and on the steel, rose up a little bit more vertically. The ones baked on the stone and on the tray spread out a little bit more sideways. The heat really makes the loaf jump up. Comparing the thickness of the crusts, we can clearly see that the one baked on the stone is very thin. Of course, we don't want the crust to be extremely thick, but it should have some thickness to it, like a millimeter or 2. And it should be crispy, not soft. And I'm talking about a regular loaf of bread here, not your soft dinner rolls. We need to be able to slice this, smear it with butter, all without breaking it and tearing it up. So have we answered the question of which baking surface is the best? It is the heavy baking steel, in my opinion, because it's the most versatile. But a cast iron pan, especially one with a lid, is a game changer too. So what's your preferred baking surface? Let me know down in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this one, click over here. Subscribe to the channel, click right here. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.